Yes, everybody ready? Great. Thank you for that wonderful introduction from Yaroslav on the Soviet expectation that Ukraine would collapse and the perspective on Ukraine from decolonization. Now we get the other side of the coin. I'm just going to quote a little bit from Asta, who set the theme at the start of this conference, Asta from the President's office, asking the question, why is Russia behaving as it is? In the West, the Second World War sort of ended in 1945. Here, the Second World War really only ended in 1993. And for Russia, it never seemed to have ended at all. They're still at war against the quote-unquote fascists and has not gone through de-Sovietization. So the title for our discussion is Russia from shades of grey to black and white. So we go backwards, maybe, in terms of a discussion on Russia. And I have two Sovietologists, specialists in this region, to talk to me about this and to explain to you what is happening. We're going to start with Nicolas Werth, who is a French historian, a specialist of Stalinism and Soviet state violence, emeritus research director at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and now also the head of the NGO Memorial International. So if I can ask you, was it you to go first, or was it Emilia to go first?
I think it's
Apologies,
Emilia
I've just got myself the wrong way around. I do apologize. I'm going to introduce now Emilia, and I won't run through the introduction to you again, but I will just mention your name. I'm going to start with Emilia Koustova, who is a professor in Russian and Soviet Studies at Strasbourg University and a fellow at the Department of Slavic Studies there. Please, Emilia.
Thank you
I believe
very
you have
much.
some slides.
Yes,
so
I will stay there. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for this invitation and for the pleasure and the big interest of all the discussions and panels which we have assisted since this morning. I'm perfectly conscious that we are 5 o'clock and everybody is tired, so I will try to go quickly and not to lose you in the way, on the way. I will use this metaphor of shades of gray. Even I think it deserves to be debated. It's not. I'm not sure we all understand this metaphor in the same way. I will take it now like maybe a situation. I will explain how I use it, but sometimes I will replace it by polyphony. And I will explain. So I will use this metaphor to briefly speak about what preceded in Russia in the field of the historical politics since 30 years. And the last 3 decades could be indeed described as a period when shades of gray were present in Russian historical representations, albeit without excluding many binary patterns and representations. This period stands out as one of polyphony, in contrast both to what preceded in the Soviet era and also to what we are witnessing today since 3 or 4 years in a particularly strong way. I mean a return to a binary version of the past and present, painted in black and white, or rather maybe in black and white red. So what were the shades of gray observed until recently? I propose to distinguish 2 dimensions, or even sometimes 2 stages of these shades of gray. On the one hand, a polyphony which emerged in the 90s in front and against the Soviet narratives, and on the other hand, an assumed tendency towards syncretism and ambiguity, which were evident in Putin's historical politics until some years ago. I don't think we need to remind here in Vilnius how important the rediscovery of forbidden parts of history and the contestation of the official Soviet narratives, historical narrative, were, how important they were for challenging the Soviet regime during perestroika and finally to make it to disappear. In Russia, as elsewhere in the post-communist world, these binary black and white or black and red patterns were challenged and more or less largely rejected. In the 90s, in Russia, new, more complex and heterogeneous historical narratives replaced them in school textbooks, in media, commemorations on symbolic policies. This polyphony did not, however, prevent the emergence of new shortcuts, simplifications, and new black and white pictures of the past. Thus, the revision of Soviet narratives often conducted in Russia to a glorification of the pre-revolutionary state, imperial state, including the most imperialist and reactionary of its policies. Without signifying the triumph of nuanced, complex, critical approaches to the past, this plurality, this polyphony, made it possible for such more complex approaches to develop, thanks to the action of various university research centers or NGOs like Memorial. Depending on the milieu that you frequented as a historian in the 90s or 2000s, you might have had the impression that such approaches were like a mainstream, making it impossible to turn back the clock, despite the presence of some or even of many warring signs. And between these warring signs, we have to mention the rehabilitation of the Soviet era, including the Stalinism. In the absence of any systematic critical reappraisal of the totalitarian experience, the Soviet past quickly appeared, in the eyes of some, or even many Russians, as an object of nostalgia, and soon a source of pride and acclaimed heritage. We know the extent to which this rehabilitation was encouraged by Putin, who sent out signals even before his election in 2000. And then he multiplied declarations and gestures in this direction after his election. However, his action in the field of history remained ambiguous for a long time. Although he showed an early interest in history as a political tool, his memory policies were implemented gradually and only began to threaten the prevailing polyphony after 10 or maybe 15 years of his reign. And his play and his ambiguity with Soviet patterns and the rehabilitation of Stalin did not exclude innovations and openings. The result was a very strong syncretism in terms of both content and form. Traditional for historical policies tools like public commemorations or new monuments were combined with modern technologies and innovative formats. The representations conveyed were just as syncretic, combining themes inherited from the Soviet narrative, like the cult of victory in the Second World War, and those that emerged after 1991, especially this imperial heritage. Such a selective and eclectic use of the history conducted to purge the news narratives from some elements and recycle anything that could support the patriotic discourse that glorified a great 1,000 years old Russia, a powerful state with strong leaders. While Bolshevism was condemned, Stalinism was treated in a deliberately ambiguous way, conducting to some surprising coincidences and contributing to the rehabilitation of the Stalinist period and Stalinist policies. Among these coincidences, for example, in the 2015, in the Urals, the Russian authorities took control of and finally destroyed Perm 36, the only formerly independent museum of political repression created on the site of a Gulag camp. So they destroyed it, but the same year in Moscow, the Museum of the History of the Gulag moved to a new big building with a new and beautiful exhibition, and all this was made possible by a support from the local government, from Moscow government, but also from the federal government. So very schizophrenic situation. And another, maybe even more surprising situation, in 2017, when there was also always a big pressure on memorial, on some independent historians, etc., in Moscow we had an inauguration, two new monuments. One was to Stalin, and 2 months after, a wall of sorrow was inaugurated in the center of Moscow, and it is a monument to the victims of political repressions. So, this eclectic approach also included an openness to some new themes, often borrowed from the West, such as the First World War, or, for example, the Holocaust memory and in more large way, the Jewish history. And here is just one example of such eclectic approach and borrowing with this beautiful museum opened in 2012, which is very important, and which also was very largely used and instrumentalized by Putin, who appeared at many occasions in this museum, as you can see, with different personalities, and we can conclude that it is also a part of the Russian efforts of this period to have a soft power policies. But we have also other examples of a more aggressive approach, and I think here in Lithuania such examples are well known, because the topic of Holocaust was largely used, is largely used today to accuse the Baltic states and Ukrainian population as perpetrators, and there is a lot of publications coming from secret police archives which serve to accuse the neighbor countries and peoples, etc. So, what is happening now? Now we are assisting to a real end of such ambiguous situation, because since some years, and especially since the beginning of the full-scale aggression against Ukraine, there is no more ambiguity in the Putin's discourse of about the history. And again, we could take various examples, and I find that one of the most interesting, and it is how now the Holocaust is treated, or how it is not treated in the many Russian governmental projects. And here is one of such projects, very well promoted, and if you do search on this website created in 2022. If you search, for example, with the keywords like Auschwitz or Auschwitz, you find some of them, but if you look inside, you discover, and it is, I have to admit, it was like a shock for me, because I didn't expect it in 2040, to see it in 2024, that you have, so for 18 mentions, you have only one which mention Jews about Auschwitz. So, and really, if you have some familiarity with the Soviet textbooks or books, you have the impression when you read the texts on this website, you have the impression that the texts come directly from the Soviet textbooks. And just to maybe to say that this project, it's not just one site among, I don't know, 1,000 others. The person who is at the head of this project, she is, it is a historian who is one of the heads of a like popular front, which president is Vladimir Putin. So it is one of the actors, or should be one of the actors of Putin's historical politics. And just to finish with some images which I think are the images that speak for themselves, such some posters produced by the Russian Ministry of Defense, and which are proposed on the site of the Ministry for the reproduction. And if you look to them, again, you have a déjà vu impression, because many of them use directly the Soviet texts, the Soviet imagery, the Soviet vocabulary. But if you, when you look at them, I thought just that we can say that it is a clear return to the binary black and white, or black and red approach, isn't it? But at the same time, this new Russian propaganda seems also to renounce to any desire even for visual innovation, and it produces a graphic production whose lack of creativity would put the Stalinist Sovinformbureau to shame. Yeah, but it's I'm ironic now, and clearly the problem is not this lack of visual innovation, but I think this lack is also able to tell us something about how far back Russian historical narrative, Russian propaganda is going now, yeah, and how radical is this rupture with what they tried to do in the 2000s and even 2010s. Thank you.
Let me invite Nicolas.
Yes, again, history is very important for Putin's regime. I tried to elaborate on it in a little essay I wrote in 2022 called Putin Historian in Chief. Now I would just like, in 15 minutes, no more, I hope, to talk to you about the last textbooks, school textbooks of 10th and 11th grade. On April 25, 2013, while addressing to the members of a Russian Historical Society, Vladimir Putin stated, it is not normal that there are 65 history textbooks in use today. History textbooks must present a unified perspective and an official point of view. And so for many years, the Russian Historical Society, which was led by very highly influential Sergei Narishkin, the head of a foreign intelligence service of Russia, tried to put what they called a common standard in culture and history aligned with Russian geopolitical interests. The process took quite a long time, many years, but finally it was completed only, we can say, in 2022, 2023, and the task of writing finally the now unique textbook was entrusted to Vladimir Medinsky, the Minister of Culture from 2012 to 2020, known for his historical revisionism. Thus, at the start of the 2023 school year, students in their penultimate and final years received the new textbooks, 2 large volumes of 480 pages each. The first, for the 10th grade, covers history of Russia from 1914 till 1945, while the second, for final year students, covers the history of Russia from 45 till 2023. So let's start quickly with a breakdown of the first textbook. About 1/3 is devoted to the years 1914, 1922, and the first chapter on the Great War concludes with Russia played a decisive role in the victory over German hegemonic militarism. No, not a word about the Western Front. There's only, in few lines, the mention of bloody battle of Verdun. And the following 100 pages detail the Russian revolutions and the ensuing civil war. And it's immediately explained that the canonical Soviet term of the Great October Socialist Revolution is no longer applicable. The revolution was neither great nor socialist. It was really a disaster, a time of trouble, where neither the whites nor the reds were the victors, but rather the foreign interventionists whose only aim was to weaken Russia. And the Civil War was just a tragedy, a national tragedy, instigated by foreign interventionists. The 150 pages which cover the 1920s and 30s sharply criticize Lenin, and especially his nationality policy. The right inscribed in the 1924 Constitution of national republics to leave the USSR is described as a real time bomb that ultimately made the Russian people the most fragmented and dispersed people in the world. And what Professor Hrysak told us. And these words are taken directly from Putin's article published in July 1921 on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In contrast, the 1930s, and totally in line with the Soviet-era textbooks, are celebrated as a decade of accelerated industrial development, unprecedented growth in the standard of living and the cultural level of a Soviet man, a new man. The Gulag is mentioned in just a few lines, about 6 lines, And you must know that in the textbooks of the 1990s, but even of the 2000s, there were at least 10 or 15 pages on the Gulag. The Gulag is just mentioned in a few lines in the chapter titled The Great Turn of Industrialization, just in these few lines. In 1929, the government decided to utilize the labor of prisoners. In 1930, Gulag was established, which facilitated the exploitation of resources in the country's remote region. This workforce also contributed to the construction of the Baltic White Sea Canal and the Moscow-Volga Canal. And the Gulag will not ever be mentioned anymore, nor in this, nor in the final year of secondary school, except for, again, 2 or 3 sentences which arrive after Stalin's death. Also, no more than 10 lines in these very thick textbooks about the famines of 1931-1937, whose toll was at least, well, about between 6.5 and 7 million dead. Barely 3 pages are devoted to political repressions of a Great Terror of 1937-38, which is again reduced to the purges of senior party officials, economic leaders, and the Red Army, contrary to the historiography of both Russian and Western scholars from the 1990s to the 2010s, which showed that the great majority of the Great Terror victims were ordinary citizens categorized as socially harmful elements. In a lengthy chapter devoted to the USSR foreign policy in the 1930s, special attention is given to condemning the Munich Pact, described as the key event that opened the door to the Second World War. In line with Soviet textbooks, the Red Army invasion of eastern Poland on September 17, 1939, is presented as a campaign to liberate the Ukrainian and Belarusian brotherly peoples and territories from the Polish yoke. And similarly, of course, the annexation of the Baltic states in 1940 is described as, quote, a request for incorporation following free elections by Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians to join the USSR. Nearly 200 pages are devoted to the great patriotic war history, and military operations are detailed extensively, nearly 150 pages only on military operations between June 41 until May 45. No mention is made of Stalin's overwhelming responsibility for the early defeats in the war, the purges of senior military officials, the refuse to take seriously the warnings from all sides about the imminent German attack, and major strategic and tactical errors. Other fronts of the Second World War deemed negligible do not appear in the textbooks. A few lines mention the ethnic cleansing campaigns targeting Jews and Gypsies conducted by the Einsatzgruppen, and, quote, Babin Yar in Kiev thus became the symbol of the planned murders of Jews, and Hatyn, which is the Belarusian village not far from Minsk, which was burned and its inhabitants slaughtered by Nazi special divisions, was the symbol of a genocide of Russian civilians. No figures are provided for Jewish victims in the USSR, but one says that 15 to 18 million Soviet citizens fell victims to the genocide of Soviet people. Regarding the collaboration of a population in the occupied zones with the Nazis, only the collaboration of Ukrainian nationalists from the UPA OUN is mentioned, specifically accused of committing a genocide of Polish civilian population in Volhynia. And the last chapter of the 10th grade history textbooks concludes with the liberating triumph of the Red Army. 147 million people from 13 Central and Eastern European countries were freed from Nazi rule. Victory for the USSR. This is how the first chapter of the last grade in schools textbooks dedicated to post-war USSR begins. Not a word is mentioned about the Allies' contribution to victory and who are swiftly transformed into enemies. The United States, quote, as early as the end of 1945, American military forces were developing plans to drop 30, 50, or even 100 atomic bombs on the USSR. The Cold War is extensively covered over several chapters, emphasizing the victory of communists in the brotherly countries of Central and Eastern Europe. This victory was attributed to the immense material aid provided by the USSR to these countries and to the moral authority of the USSR, which liberated Europe from Nazi rule. I go very quickly about the death of Stalin on March 5, 1953, which evoked compassion and grief among simple people around the world. Nikita Khrushchev's victory is very severely criticized. His time was, quote, characterized by rash and thoughtless actions, such as the transfer of Crimea to the Ukrainian SSSR in 1954, without even consulting its population, which was predominantly Russian. Fortunately, historical justice was finally restored in 2014. The pages on Soviet foreign policy under Khrushchev briefly mention Hungarian crisis of 1956, instigated by Western intelligence services and anti-Soviet forces. And as for the Soviet missile base crisis established in Cuba in 1962, they were fully justified due to the threat posed by American bases in Turkey. Finally, the happiest period of our history, reads in the textbook, for the vast majority of our people was the Brezhnev era. The textbook is full of praise for Brezhnev. During these years, the Soviet people were a united people, thanks to a planned policy based on a fraternal cooperation of all the republics of the USSR, in which Russia played a leading role. The backward peripheries, like the Baltic States republics, experienced exceptional industrial and cultural development. So you can appreciate about your backwardness in the 1960s and 70s. Unlike the Brezhnev era, the Gorbachev era is harshly criticized by the authors of the textbooks. I quote, "None of the reforms undertaken by Gorbachev produced positive results. Constant improvisation and incompetence of the leaders and powers led to deep disorganization of production, destroyed the distribution system, caused terrible shortage and an economic catastrophe. The policy of glasnost resulted in a loss of control over information. Soviet society, which had for decades believed in and respected everything that was written, had absolutely no immunity against this manipulation. Thus, glasnost turned under the conditions of systemic pressure from the West into a powerful weapon for the ideological reformatting of Soviet society. The criticism, of course, expanded equally to Gorbachev's foreign policy, and the textbooks concludes the first part on the history of Russia from 1945 to 1991 with the famous words of Vladimir Putin: "The collapse of the USSR was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century." The high school textbooks devotes a second section, nearly 200 pages, to the history, very interesting part of the Russian Federation over the past 30 years, 1992, 2023. The narrative is entirely based on the contrast between two periods. The 1990s, a catastrophic decade for the country, and the years 2020, characterized as a profound revival of Russia, both domestically and internationally. The 1990s were marked by shock therapy, implemented economically by liberal politicians aligned with the West. The shock therapy ensured super profits for Western firms, while our country was reduced to a periphery supplying raw materials to the West. The economic situation of Russia continuously deteriorated. In the 1990s, under the influence of Western propaganda, traditional Russian values, kindness, justice, a sense of community, generosity, a sense of sacrifice, were trampled upon. The idea was instilled that the ultimate goal of the individual was personal success and material well-being, with contempt for collective values and indifference to the suffering of others. The arrival of young President Vladimir Putin in power in 2000 completely changed the situation. His priorities: fight against terrorism, reconnect the grand history of Russia, and restore our authentic values, strengthen the vertical power structure, and shift the balance of power with the collective West. By launching and winning the Second Chechen War, Putin eliminated, quote, "the terrorist bands from the North Caucasus, generously funded by foreign entities and composed of Arab national and Ukrainian nationalists, the same one who would participate in the 2014 coup in Kiev." Russia experienced in the 2000s a genuine spiritual renaissance. The reconstruction of a Christ Savior Cathedral in Moscow became the symbol of Russia's spiritual revival. No country in the world throughout the history of Christianity has experienced such a construction boom of churches. The high school textbooks concludes with an incredible, lengthy chapter on the special military operation. This operation is described as a response to the threats from collective West and the Ukrainian junta that it has installed in Kiev. Quote, "The fixed ideas of a collective West is to destabilize Russia in 3 stages, along the borders, to draw Russia into a series of conflicts and color revolution, to dismember Russia and take control of its wealth. The first anti-Russian torpedo launched by the West was in 2008, the attack by the pro-American Georgian regime of Saakashvili of South Ossetia. The second anti-Russian torpedo, the bloody coup of February 2014 against the legitimate President Yanukovych, who was ousted from power in Kiev by a military junta actively supported by the West, with the goal of turning Ukraine into the real battering ram against Russia. And finally, a very lengthy section explained to students what is Ukrainian neo-Nazism. Ukrainian neo-Nazism is not a variant of German National Socialism of the 1920s, 40s. It is a completely new phenomenon, unleashed violence, linguistic, cultural, and national, from a minority against a majority. Since the 2014 coup, Russian culture has not only been banned, it has become enemy culture that are of colonizers, occupiers. Those who lead the dance today are the Western Ukrainians who are trying to impose their dialect, their worldview, their version of history by force. To restore the goals of special military operation, to restore peace by ousting the junta in power in Kiev, and to resist the pressure from the West, which is trying to strangle Russia with illegal sanctions. And the textbooks close with portraits of about 15 heroes of a special military operation who fell in combat. And the final sentences read, "These genuine heroes of our time are among us, models of bravery, honor, and faith in the rightness of our cause. Their names and deeds are inscribed in the long line of heroes and historic episodes of our great Russian national history. It has always been this way, and it will always be this way forever." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Yeah, please bring your microphone with you. Please bring the mic. Thank you. First thing I'd just like to do is to ask whether you, Emilia, would like to respond to anything or think of anything that Nicolas has said, or Nicolas, maybe if you remember back to Emilia's, is there anything that you would like to say to each other?
Well, again, it was very useful to have Emilia, Koustova,
Thank you.
presentation, because she showed that it's a long history from the 1990s until today, and that there was a real polyphony before. I can just give a personal example. In 1992, my textbook, History of Russia, was translated in Russian, and after 1992, it was recommended by Minister of Higher Education to be a textbook in universities. Well, a long way has passed. I don't think I was exactly in the line of Soviet historiography or post-Soviet. So it's an incredible trajectory, but I think it's very important to see that things were different. And I think 2022, it's also the banning of Memorial, and so just before the war. And I think that the banning of Memorial NGO was really the prelude to the war. There is a link between end of December 2021, the banning of Memorial, and the 24th of February 2022.
Thank you. Emilia, is there something you would like? No, you have your own. Don't worry.
Yes, sure. That maybe I can, first of all, I can bring a proof. I don't think what you are saying needs to some proof, but I can't, it's so, yeah. I was maybe the first generation of young Russians who prepared their exams at school, high school, and then the exams to enter to the university with your textbook. Yeah. Oh. I still have it. It is the first edition of 92, and yeah.
Can I pick up your point about Memorial being banned and just ask the very general question? Is there actually anybody left in Russia to kind of talk about the plural approach, the shades of grey, different narratives? Is there anybody there, Emilia?
Yeah, there are people who stay there. Many of them really choose it. Even they are perfectly conscious of the danger they have, danger which is represented by their choice to stay there. And we have some university colleagues who told us by phone, etc., that they stayed because there are young people who are very disgusted by the war, who completely disagree with Putin's politics, who really need to continue to hear and to study other history. And so these colleagues stayed there, choose to stay there, to be close to these young people, because everybody can't leave and everybody can't go to Western countries. And so I think that that choice was made by them maybe 2 years ago, when it was this big move from Russia to Georgia, or to Lithuania, to Germany, to Turkey, of Russian intellectuals. And then these people choose to stay there. Some of them were really, some of them were accused since that moment. And I think that now it is really civic choice to be there, to continue to teach. And obviously there are also people from Memorial who stayed there and who continue, even with what maybe before it was like a completely innocent activities, as like go to visit the places in Moscow, in other cities where repressions have been done, like Lubyanka, etc. So Memorial organized these activities for many years, and now just some days before I looked to the Telegram chain with the people photographed during these visits, and I was thinking, but maybe in 2 weeks they will be arrested, because there are those their photos, the people who comes to see these places where Soviet repressions were realized. And I think it's from just last sentence that since the beginning of the full-scale aggression against Ukraine, I think there was like a new connection between Putin's present and Stalin's past. And maybe this connection, it is something that missed before. And in the maybe 90s, 2000s, after this first discovery of the Stalinist and Soviet past, the history was no more fashionable, was no more interesting for the Russian people in the 2000s. And I think that even the Russian intellectuals maybe did not realize at that time how actual was this history and how important was this connection. And this connection is again made now, but it is maybe too late. At least it can't change something related to the aggression against Ukraine and the war against Ukraine.
Nicolas, do you think that, I assume that you had many contacts in the Soviet Union over the many years among the dissident community, for example. Do you think there are lessons that can be learnt now by the people who have stayed in Russia about how to operate from the dissidents of the past?
Well, yes, because the old generation of Memorial are often children of dissidents, for example. A very famous Daniel is the son of
Alexander Daniel.
Alexander is the son of Yuli Daniel, who was a great dissident and so on. And so, yes, of course, there is this tradition, but one must understand that it's much worse now in the sense that maximum penalty was 7 years under Article 70 of Penal Code, Soviet Penal Code. And now Karamurza had got 25 years, and many got 18 years or 15 years, Dmitriev and so on. So things are worse, and the system of control is much more efficient now, because before it was really quite primitive, but now with all the technology, we must understand that recently we had a case of one of our colleagues of Memorial who was arrested, and well, he's not yet condemned, but because a email was intercepted, and he was arrested on this charge from some other people from Memorial who are not in Russia. And there is still a Russian Memorial with several branches, but it's really an underground, and they have a very, very tough time.
Okay. We have time for one question. So, oh, yes, there's a very deliberate question here. Do we have an extra microphone that we can give to this lady in the white in the front? Please let us know who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Mariana Semenyak. I'm working at Open Lithuania Foundation. I'm Ukrainian myself. It was very interesting to listen to both your presentations. Just a few things I remembered. The last slide by Emilia, it was how nowadays Russia and Putin's strategy is referring to Soviet propaganda, and it makes me smile because there was actually a Ukrainian three knights, three bohaters, which I was like, okay, no surprise, even here you're using his Ukrainian background. And about Nicolas, my reflection was like, oh my God, so it's kind of new next Russian generation preparing like in 1939, you know, like for this big dominant over other nations, like what will be the result, you know, like of these millions of schools, students, pupils who gonna follow textbook. I mean, the one who are like, let's say, not critical thinker, not the real opposition, but you know, like what is gonna follow in the next years. And I wanted to share one little example. In the beginning of full-scale invasion, I was participating in a conference in Rome. At the panel discussion, it was Russian liberal, it was Belarusian women, it was me. And she was representing like Russian liberals' point of view, right? And she said the phrase, what is our common sense here, like what is making us together here? It's like we are enemy of Putin, like Putin is against us. And then when it came to me, I said, no, what makes everything against us is Russian imperialism. It's not Putin itself, but it's imperialism in general. So my question here is, how far is conversation going among Russian liberals, Russian opposition, Russian critical thinker about making Russia small again? About making it small again. Thank you. Looking for your answers.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes, Jana. So you can... No. Okay, he says no. Not me. Keep it for the drinks. So we have, if you want to reflect on the Ukrainian images, I imagine somewhat deliberate, what you may think happens to Russian school children, but particularly how far are Russian liberals considering making Russia small again?
Well,
Start with you, Nicolas.
I'll quote, yeah, maybe very short, because it's a very interesting question. Well, I shall quote one of our great, Russian emigres, great translator in France, Andrei Markovitch, and he wrote a wonderful little book which is called What About and If Ukraine Saved Russia? Because, well, that was exactly the idea of Rysak. Defeat of Russia would save, well, victory of Ukraine would save Russia in a way. But what we try with Memorial, and this is very important idea of Memorial, is one. First important idea is that the collapse, there was a kind of collapse of memorial work because we didn't get to the point where Russian society really, thought about переосмыслить, so I don't know how to say this in English. Yes, rethink of its past, which is really the core of the problem, because now if people support Putin, it is because in the past 30 years, no real rethinking of the past had been made, despite the effort of Memorial and so on. And this is one of the legacy of late Arseny Roginsky, who chaired Memorial for years. In one of the last interviews he gave, he said, well, we failed in a way. We failed, unfortunately. We tried, but we didn't succeed, because over 30 years, and I think this is very important. And I just want to add again that one of the key ideas of Memorial is also, we have 17 branches now, and one of the branch is Ukrainian. So the collaboration between Ukrainian and Russia is absolutely at the core of the struggle of Memorial. So it's very important that this subject of the war and the necessity of a dialogue between Russia and Ukraine continues.
Let me give the final word to Emilia.
Yeah, maybe just to connect these ideas, that I think that when Memorial started its work in the late 80s, when the people from Memorial talk about rethink the past, they were talking about rethinking the totalitarian Soviet past. What is absolutely clear now that not only the Russian society has to rethink totalitarian past, and it's also its responsibility or responsibility of its state in this past, but also the Russian imperial past. And I think that is new. It is a new challenge which makes the challenge bigger and more difficult. I'm not sure everybody among liberal opposition is conscious of it, but yeah, this opposition is not homogeneous. It is not only black or white. There are shades of gray, and a big work has to be done.
Great,
That's
thank
sure.
you. I think that's a wonderful place to pause before we, of course, continue the discussion over drinks. Would you all join with me to say thank you to our contributors?
Thank you.